Hello, my friends. Hello, it's Matthew Street, and welcome to my channel. As always, I truly appreciate you being here. And folks, it's time to go back to those 1980s. Yes, it is, folks. I am here to jump on another tag. I don't do too many of these because, they're hard to put together and you got to pull stuff everywhere, and it can be a real time-consuming thing. But one of my best friends here in the vinyl music, CD, Beatles, everything community, Schnee, he just posted a great new tag. And for my friend Steven, I got to do it. And so, folks, this is the Schnee 1980s music tag, all formats. Okay, so you can have any format involved in this tag, which I think is great, and it opens the door up to so many other people that might not get involved. So anyway, Stephen has 10 questions here, one bonus question. I've done my best to organize everything here as I could. I tried to look as 1980s as I could for you. I was hoping I still had, I remember my kids had back in the 80s, had one of those baseball hats that Marty McFly wore in Back to the Future. It was like a rainbowish psychedelic kind of colored baseball hat. I was hoping I could still find one of those, but those are long gone. But I think I have kind of like some 1980s glasses here. I got my old white hat with the blue rim, and I'm wearing a t-shirt from 2022 when I went to see the the stadium tour with a lot of great 80s metal and rock bands. We had Motley Crue, Def Leppard, Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, and Poison. And there's some cassettes. So I figured this is close enough to look 1980s. Okay, let's get right into it, folks. I did the best I could. There were so many other artists I had to leave out because you can only include so many in each of these questions. So this is not all encompassing of all the 80s music that I love and have in my collection. But there you go. I did the best I could. So question number one is, Steven says, what was your favorite music genre in the 1980s? And then show some examples of it. So many great genres I love. I mean, heavy metal, hair metal from the 80s I love. But my favorite genre from the 80s was power pop. What else would it be? And here are some examples of some power pop music I loved in the 1980s. The Smithereens' Green Thoughts album. Great album. The Producers, self-titled The Producers. The Sponge Tones, beat music. All examples of power pop in the 80s I loved. And The Outfield, Play Deep. All right, so there's a couple of quickies of my favorite genre, power pop, and some examples of it. Number two, show the album or artist that got you into the genre of the 1980s music that you are going to focus on for your video. Well, it didn't officially come out in the 80s, but this was the album that set me on the path. I had already been into power pop in the early 70s with Badfinger, Raspberries. I started getting into Cheap Trick in the late 70s, that kind of stuff. But the album that really cemented it for me going headstrong into the 1980s, loving power pop, was Get the Knack by The Knack. When this album came out, this came out the summer of 1979, but it helped push me into, like, later that year. Paul Collins' The Beat album came out. I got into that. That was late 79. 2020's album came out in late 1979. And this album and those other two helped propel me into the 1980s, loving and looking for and searching for power pop. Number three, what is your favorite year for music in the 80s? And show some examples. That's a tough one because, there's so much great music from every year of the 1980s that I love. But I'll pick a random one. I was going to pick 1982, but I think Steven did in his video. So just randomly, I chose 1983 and some of my favorites from 1983. The Fix, Reach for the Beach. The Police, Synchronicity. ABC, The Lexicon of Love. Def Leppard, Pyromania. Marshall Crenshaw, Field Day. The Romantics, one of my favorites from 83, In Heat. All right, so I'll pick 1983 as my favorite year, and those some examples. Number 4, which format did you prefer to collect in the 80s? Well, I have to be honest, I was a big cassette guy in the 80s. Never got rid of my vinyl, and I still would grab vinyl here and there. And then, of course, in the late 80s, CDs came out, and I went heavily into the CD collection mode and stopped cassettes. Unfortunately, I got rid of a lot of my cassettes. I never got rid of my vinyl, but for some reason, I unloaded all my cassettes pretty much. And I'm sad to say I did so now. I wish I had them now. But I did still have a few survivors, lone survivors that hung in there. And so I'll show you those. I have the soundtrack to the late 80s movie with Andrew Dice Clay called Ford Fairlane, The Adventures of Ford Fairlane. So I still have that on cassette from the 80s. Perfect one for the 80s, Back to the Future, the soundtrack. Have that on cassette. The Knack Round Trip cassette. And even though this artist isn't from the 80s, I collected their music that would be re-released in the 80s, and I grabbed them all. And I have the Beatles' Real Music on cassette from the 80s, 1982, and the other one from 82, the Beatles' 20 Greatest Hits. I also have a cassette of Def Leppard, Hysteria, from the 80s. Randomly hung on to that one, but I got rid of a lot of my others, and I feel bad about that. So cassette, though, was my big thing I was pulling in the 80s. Question 5. Who were your favorite artists of the 1980s? And then show an example of each. Okay, my favorite artist, where did I put that one? Okay, right here. My favorite artists in the 1980s were Marshall Crenshaw. Here's his first self-titled album. And Cheap Trick. And this is Lap of Luxury. All right, so those are my 2 favorite artists of the 1980s that I was really into collecting, among many others. I'm leaving out so many. Number 6, show an album that you felt was underrated in the 1980s and that you would like to encourage people to check it out. Folks, a lot of people slag off this album, but I liked it when it first came out, and I didn't understand why it didn't sell well. I didn't understand why people didn't care for it that much. But I love it, and I encourage you all, if you want to get a little taste of the 1980s great pop album, get ELO, Balance of Power. I love this album. Not much to the cover, a little plain, but it's a great little album. It was the last one for ELO on their first run until they broke up for several years and then reunited again. Then it became Jeff Lynne's ELO. But check out ELO's Balance of Power from 1986. It's a great underrated album, and it should get a re-listen by you. Show an album, number 7. Show an album that you liked or loved in the 80s, but now you actually appreciate it now more than ever. Again, so many could fit to all these questions. Great questions by Stephen, but I want to show a wide variety of artists. So I'm going to pick Everything by the Bangles. I did love and like this album when it first came out in the later 80s. I think 87 or so it came out. I could be wrong on that. Not sure. Help me. But this is just a fantastic album, and I've grown to love it more. There's songs on here that, when the album first came out, I didn't really care for it, and now they've just grown on me, and I love them. There's not really a bad track on this album in my world. So the Bangles, Everything would be an album that I loved or liked in the 80s, but now I really appreciate it now more than ever. I love the Bangles. I've collected everything by them. Fantastic. Check it out. Everything by the Bangles. Number 8. Name an artist that became popular in the 1980s and that you still feel is creating great music. This could be the same group or solo releases by a new group with a returning member or whatever. But folks, as many I could think of, but I'm just going to go with my old standby that I love, Cheap Trick. They, started in the later 70s. Powerhouses came into the 80s and released great stuff in the 1980s, like this album, One on One from 1981. Next Position Please, 1983. Of course, Lap of Luxury, I just showed you. I mean, great band all through the 80s. Saw them live many times in the 80s. And folks, even though it didn't just come out this year, but only like a couple of years ago in 2021, or so, Cheap Trick released one of their finest albums ever, In Another World. So they're still out there doing it, rocking it live. They're still putting out great material. This is their most recent studio album. I'm sure there's another one coming down the pike, In Another World, just a couple of years ago. And they've been doing it since the 70s into the 80s. Cheap Trick. Okay. Number 9, show an album or a CD or a box set of an 80s album that first was released in the 80s, but then was reissued in 2023. That's an easy one for me. Marshall Crenshaw's Field Day. First came out in 1983. Loved it. Fantastic album. And it got a reissue in 2023 with deluxe edition, expanded bonus tracks, and a brand new cover that Marshall approved of this time. He never liked the original cover of Field Day, but he loves this one, and I love this one. So Marshall Crenshaw's Field Day. First came out in 83. 40 years later, in 2023, it got a reissue, all remixed and remastered. Check it out. Number 10, show an 80s album that influenced you to pursue a different style or genre. That's pretty easy because I kind of like the pioneers of rock and roll and that style. I was into Elvis and Buddy Holly by the 1980s and stuff, but there's 3 albums I'm going to show you here that really cemented a new genre for me, and I really started getting into collecting it and getting heavily into it and loving it up to this day. And that's rockabilly. I really got into rockabilly due to these artists right here. And they influenced me to really jump into it both feet and collect rockabilly. And one is, I think it came out in 79, but it's called Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die by Robert Gordon. It came out in 79, I believe, but this was the first one that really started propelling me into loving rockabilly. This is a great album, and he has many other albums that came out in the later 70s into the 80s. But check out stuff by Robert Gordon to get into rockabilly. But then 2 that definitely came out in the 1980s. One is this one by Shakin' Stevens when I was in the service overseas in the UK. I know he's not big in the United States, but Shakin' Stevens was huge overseas in Europe and the United Kingdom. And this album right here, This Old House, really cemented it for me, really even more loving rockabilly and that old style rock and roll that I love to this day. And the final one, the big one you all will know, is the Stray Cats, Built for Speed. It was released here in the United States in 1982. Now, I knew about them before this because, like I said, I was in the UK from late 79 until early 82, and I had some of their UK albums. So I was really heavily getting into the Stray Cats and their style, that rockabilly, modern rockabilly style. But this was the one that first came out in the US, took the US by storm. And so I'm going to show you this one, the Stray Cats, Built for Speed. And those 3 albums were definitely artists that influenced me to check out a different genre or a different style, and I'm still loving it to this day, rockabilly. Bonus question. Show an album that you feel would be essential for anyone wanting to get into the 1980s music. Could be their gateway to the 80s. And he doesn't want compilations or greatest hits. Okay, I've got to show a couple here then real quick. I would recommend Green by REM. If you want to get into some great 80s music, I would recommend the first Crowded House album called Crowded House. And last but not least, not my favorite album by this artist, but I do love this album, Heartbeat City by the Cars. This is a fantastic album, folks. Not my favorite Cars album. That would be the first one or the second one, but I love this one as well. And this would definitely, if I had out of all those 3 I just showed you, I would definitely say this one would be the one I would say this would be your gateway to 80s music. Get Heartbeat City by the Cars, and you'll be on your way. Well, that's it, folks. I hope I didn't take up too much time, about 15 minutes. I'm out of here. Thank you, Stephen Schnee. I'll put the link to his original video below. Check it out. Jump on the thread. 80s music thread, all genres. Stephen Schnee. Great channel, great friend. Check it out. Bye-bye.